In today's video for the First Descendant, we're going to be going over the absolute powerhouse that is the Greg's Reverse Fate. This is an amazing weapon and absolutely decimates health on bosses, elites, and is absolutely great for kind of groups of enemies as well. In my opinion, this is definitely in the top kind of 3 or 4 weapons in the game, and as well as that, it's an awful lot of fun to use, as you kind of rain down bombardments upon your enemies, doing massive amounts of damage, and the fact that it can do great single target as well as group target makes it an ideal choice in quite a lot of loadouts. In this video, I'll be going over what I believe is the very best setup for it in order to get the most damage from it. I'll be going over a few tips on what you should be putting it together and what you should be putting on it, and exactly how you can get the most from it. So if we jump over to my Greg's Reverse Fate, I've managed to hit 3 out of the 4 things I was after when I'm going for its modifiers, as I've managed to grab Firearm Attack versus Colossus, Firearm Attack in general, which is the main thing you'll be after on this weapon, and Firearm Critical Hit Damage. If I could, I would have liked to have get the weak point damage on this one just here instead of the awful one I've got, but I've been rolling this for about 4 days now and have had absolutely no joy whatsoever. If you can't get weak point, then probably crit rate would also be a really nice one to have here. Jumping over to the weapon stats, the great thing about this is kind of a hybrid weapon, and you can actually spec into both weak point damage and crit damage as well, because it specs really nicely into both of those. And by far the best thing about this is going to be its unique ability, Shaping Destiny, which procs bombardments upon enemies, as you'll see it rain down kind of fiery hits that do a really nice amount of damage in a kind of small area effect. The more you boost this up, so the more Greg's Reverse Fate you put into this Greg's Reverse Fate, the more bombardments are going to proc, and at maximum count you'll be able to get all the way up to 7. Even though the trigger rate is only 20%, because you're shooting at several bullets at once, it procs very often, and you'll see these going off all the time throughout your missions and whenever you're taking on those tough bosses. Also, another nice thing, where it does hit with them in bombardments, it's going to cause a burn effect, setting your enemies on fire, allowing you to kind of use that to your advantage. So jumping over to our first setup, and I found this to be absolutely ideal to get the kind of maximum amount of damage and to hit things as hard as is possible. There's a few things on it you'll be taking advantage of, but remember the main thing is going to be trying to get your attack rate up for your weapon, because that's what the bombardments proc off of. So the mods we're going to be putting on this is going to be Fire Conductor, because this is just going to make your life a whole bunch easier, giving 26% extra damage on burning targets, which we're going to have almost constantly because of those bombardment effects. Concentration Priority is going to give us a massive amount of critical hit damage, and even though the reload time is a little bit negative with the minus 30%, you don't really notice it too much on this weapon. Fire Rate Up is just great for increasing your damage overall because of how many bullets you'll be spraying at constantly, and like I said, because this scales pretty well with weak point as well, we're going to put on weak point sight to give us a little bit of extra damage on that, which is great when we're aiming for those Colossus weak points. Have Aiming is going to give you weak point damage plus 40% and accuracy minus 20%, so again it does have a bit of a deficit to the accuracy, but the weak point is definitely worth having. And Better Concentration is going to give you a massive amount of firearm critical hit damage at 48.8%. Specking more into that side, we're going with Insight Focus, which is going to give us 14.5% critical hit rate, as well as a nice 5% to our critical hit damage. And then Action and Reaction, which is one you need in almost every build that you can fit it in, is going to give us 61% firearm attack, but it does give you a negative to your recoil. Firearm attack plus 32% with your rifle reinforcement, and lastly one you're definitely going to want is going to be Better Insight, as that's going to scale your critical hit rate very nicely indeed. Overall, I found this to be the most damage you can kind of chuck at when you're aiming for those bigger targets, but one thing you will need to be wary of is that those bombardments don't seem to be hitting the weak points even if you are. So be careful when you're in groups, because if you're completely spraying and praying, you can enrage those bosses very quickly. So sometimes I found using a weapon first and then waiting until the boss is either downed or someone's on one of the shoulders works out best before you chuck on your Greg's Reverse Fate, because then you're not going to build up that rage bar. But for solo bossing, this thing is an absolute monster. Over to the second setup, and everything is very similar. The only ones that I've tried to muck around with is going to be chucking Slow Art into this slot just here instead, and this is going to make it so that we don't hit quite as fast, so it wouldn't be perfect for single targets, but when we're going out on our missions and just using this in general, it's going to mean you've got a much sturdier and steadier aim, and it still hits like an absolute truck with those bombardments. And just down from here, one that I always like to have on, a little bit of elemental damage. This time we're going with fire enhancement because it fits into this slot nicely. It just helps you tackle some of those smaller enemies really nicely and sometimes defeats them even before the bombardments have hit them. But yeah, overall I found these setups are absolutely amazing, but like I did say earlier, be a little bit mindful with your first setup, as I found the Greg's Reverse Fate does have a bit of a kick to it, especially when you're putting all those mods on with a little bit of negative accuracy and recoil, so you may need to be at medium range in order to hit the weak spots on the Colossus and get the very most out of this build. Now I'm sure this video has gone on for slightly longer than I've intended, but hopefully you get the gist of what this weapon's all about and how good this setup is. And for a final thought, if you can, I would highly suggest you try your hardest to put shot focus on your build somewhere, because this is pretty much the only mod currently in the game that you can put on your Descendant that actually increases the attack power of your weapon, without kind of any gimmicks or any conditions involved. But yeah, hopefully that's helped a few of you guys and girls out. There'll be a lot more content away from me. As always, for All Things Gaming, take care. I'll see you on the next day.